on the approaches to Germany's western border. South of the forest, there are another 40,000 troops preparing for an offensive into Germany's Saar region. With the U.S. First Army in the Ardennes is Jules Berlinski.
I was assigned to an artillery division, and we had been chasing the German troops back towards Germany, and you know, going day by day, hedgerow by hedgerow, and it took a lot of time. We were in tanks and in half-tracks. We had tanks with 105 howitzer guns. The weather was atrocious, muddy. You couldn't get the half-tracks to move all the time. They had to be dug out in places, and it would be go and stop, go and stop. Sometimes it would be 2-3 hours before you were able to move ahead again.
The reason why the battle was in the West in the first place was Hitler realized that the resources Germany had could not do anything to turn the tide on the Eastern Front. There were just too many Russians, too many Russian tanks. But on the Western Front, there were more German divisions than Allied divisions, even as late as December of '44. And so Hitler gambled everything on a move to disrupt the Allies in the West, destroy 20 divisions of troops, and then buy time to fight in the East and maybe still win the war.
Early morning on December 16th, a shattering barrage of German artillery and rocket fire lights the skies.
We were mostly living on the ground in foxholes and stuff like that. You just dove into a foxhole and waited for the bombing to be over with.
Gloomy weather for the next several days provides effective cover for the German might that churns over the roads. Panzer units slash through. In the center, the Germans gouge a 12-mile corridor to the approaches of Bastogne. They are ordered to surround and bypass this town, then drive for the Meuse River, their first goal.
We didn't know much of what was happening around us. There was the officers who were giving orders, and we just knew we were in a bad spot.
There is all-out confusion. Communications are sketchy. American troops discovered Germans in front and behind them. Panzers, under cover of fog and rain, slip into American armored columns, then blast the Americans off the road.
We were stuck, we were cold, we were disoriented for a while. They had to pull the division together and reorganize because it was pretty bad.
10,000 troops of the inexperienced U.S. 106th Division are surrounded by the Germans. Their officers see no way out. More than 7,000 soldiers of the 106th destroy their weapons and give up. Next to Bataan, this is the largest mass surrender in military history. German deception spreads paranoia among U.S. troops. English-speaking German soldiers in American uniforms driving jeeps infiltrate American positions. Such incidents are actually few in number, but the psychological effect of the infiltration is enormous. Soon, every stranger in an American uniform is suspect. Passwords are not trusted. Unless a soldier knows typically American information, he's taken into custody. One American general is held by MPs for 5 hours because he doesn't know how many home runs Babe Ruth hit in his best year. "15,000 American airborne troops are rushed as reserves to defense positions around Bastogne. Leading them is General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. Bastogne then becomes an island in a sea of Germans.
We had the Germans on the run, and they had maneuvered themselves to be on the outsides of us, and we were chasing troops in front of us. And we were going so fast, so furious, we were really making very good headway, and suddenly we found ourselves entrapped because there were Germans completely behind us and to the sides of us. So that is what the bulge was.
For this reason, the offensive in the Ardennes is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Elsewhere, with communication shattered, other Americans fight isolated holding actions.
It was a big attack, and we needed every hand available. Even the people, the medics were out there with weapons. Everybody, even the people on kitchen duty. There was no great pleasure, but we were there, and we were holding off until Patton's regiments would come up and join us.
Gradually, small scattered units slow the German advance, especially around St. Vit. Hitler's timetable of victory is upset.
The 5th Panzer Army had good success in the southern part of the invasion. However, the effects were not what the Germans had wanted. They were trying to race to the Meuse River in 2 days, but they didn't get close.
The U.S. Army has to be ready to move at any moment. When orders come through, soldiers are expected to pack, prepare, and be on the move with very little notice.
Oh, I just remember we had to pack up very fast and get on the road and go, you know. They never told you where you were going. It was always a surprise.
It becomes obvious to U.S. intelligence that Hitler is risking everything in one last desperate military gamble. On the 3rd day, General Dwight Eisenhower orders General Patton's 3rd Army to attack the German flank and relieve Bastogne. Patton, with his army 125 miles south of the Bulge, replies with supreme confidence that he will attack within 2 days. December 20th, the Battle of the Bulge is in its 5th day. American forces are reeling under the impact of the mighty German offensive. General Patton and his 3rd Army are driving north toward Bastogne to counterattack. A freeze sets in, making it easier for the roads to support the heavy armor. Patton's army drives in a non-stop convoy through day and night. To accommodate the speed, vehicles are ordered to keep their headlights on, which is definitely not by the book. Lookouts keep a sharp watch for enemy planes and the vehicles in front of them. If there's the slightest accident among the hundreds of trucks and tanks, it can slow the entire division's progress. Radio silence is maintained, so no one, not even the Army, knows what's going on. December 21st, a wintry snow falls throughout the Ardennes. St. Vit is taken by the Germans. Now the center route across the Ardennes is wide open. The Germans flow around Bastogne on all sides, encircling the American forces there.
The German attack probably could not have succeeded without total surprise. Even though the American defenses were very weak, they were weak because the Americans thought the Germans were weak in the same sector. And what the Germans did was to move the panzers by night to get them close to the lines. They achieved total surprise, partly, again, because the American intelligence people and the Americans in general were so overconfident. They never expected an attack at that time or that place. In fact, they thought the Germans were beaten after the race across France. The Germans were not beaten, and the surprise was effectively gained. The result was that some American troops were isolated.
December 22nd, the situation in Bastogne grows desperate. Ammunition is short. McAuliffe's artillery battalions are down to 10 rounds per gun, and it's still snowing. The cold causes more casualties than German gunfire. Frostbite is rampant among the troops. The Germans send an emissary to Bastogne with an ultimatum. Since the Americans are surrounded and there is only one possibility to save them from death, an honorable surrender. General McAuliffe's reply is short and to the point.
He sent his answer back to the German authorities, and his answer was nuts.
McAuliffe's bravado is based on the expectation of the Third Army. General Patton's timetable is a critical factor. If the Germans move on Bastogne, they can easily take it at this point. The surrounded and undermanned U.S. Army watches and waits anxiously for reinforcements. The freezing cold conditions don't make it easier for either side. The same day, Patton's advance columns reach the southern end of the bulge. The German 7th Army is prepared for them. Patton's tanks, accustomed to advancing miles at a stretch, are now forced to fight for every inch of land. The snow-covered muddy ground keeps the reinforcements from reaching Bastogne. The next day, December 23rd, dawns bright and sunny. Perfect flying weather. Americans in Bastogne cheer as Allied planes fly overhead to bomb and strafe the enemy. And more importantly, to drop supplies. Not all that's needed, but enough to enable the Americans to hang on.
That was a big morale builder because we needed support, and we got this support just in time to bolster our spirits. Even though we were still eating K and C rations, it was a nice holiday time.
By Christmas Eve, the battle has been raging for 10 days. But even with the bloodshed and animosity, there is still a holiday spirit.
German occupation troops would be in these French villages, and because it was Christmas and because they were lonesome, they would hand out chocolate or whatever they had, and the French would accept it, and for one night at least, the hostility was tempered. But it wasn't unique, and there are many stories like that in the history of warfare. There are lots of stories in wartime about things like this happening.
We were bivouacked, and we had taken over this little farmhouse that was deserted. And somebody said, boy, I'd love to have some ice cream. And I thought of, how could I make ice cream? So I filled up a helmet of snow and brought it back. I mixed it with evaporated milk and chocolate syrup and vanilla and sugar, and we had ice cream.
On Christmas Day, news reaches Bastogne that the western spearhead of the German 2nd Panzer Division has been stopped just short of the Meuse. Americans speculate that the powerful tank division might now turn back on them in full force. When Hitler is told by his generals they can't reach the Meuse, much less the English Channel, he orders the expected all-out attack on Bastogne.
What people don't realize about Bastogne is that when the Germans got to Bastogne, they bypassed it. And the actual heavy fighting at Bastogne wasn't until later, after the panzers had failed to reach the Meuse. Then they turned back to Bastogne and tried to encircle it and capture it. And of course, the Americans held Bastogne. By that time, they'd been reinforced. So Bastogne, while it was important, was not the whole Battle of the Bulge.
On the afternoon of December 26th, a tank unit of Patton's 4th Armored Division breaks through to Bastogne. The next day, the corridor is widened. The siege is over, but not the fighting. December 28th, a driving snowstorm grounds all planes. The Wehrmacht advances on Bastogne with 9 divisions, 4 of them armored. A great part of this effort is aimed at closing the American corridor to the south. The Americans hold on and even widen their lifeline. On January 3rd, the Allies launch a 3-pronged counterattack. The Third Army continues its northward drive. The First Army continues south, and the British 30th Corps pushes in from the west. By January 16th, patrols from the 1st and 3rd Armies meet north of Bastogne. By early February, the Germans have been pushed back to where they started.
The Battle of the Bulge destroyed the last major offensive forces that Germany had. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, they knew they couldn't win. And from that time on, there was nobody left to fight on the Western Front. The remains of the Panzer Lehr Division was sent to the Eastern Front, where it was eventually destroyed. And with the losses in manpower, 250,000 men, it became clear that the German army no longer could fight on the Western Front.
Our tanks were going forward. We saw German tanks going the direction that we just came from, flying, and, you know, it was a bedlam. I particularly remember one tank waving to us happily, and then they realized we were Americans, and they all jumped out of the tank and got into the roadways.
Jules Berlinski would return to the United States after the war and work for a major department store in Los Angeles. It is a remarkable feat in itself for Patton's Third Army, poised to strike eastward, to turn north and race 125 miles to Bastogne in just 2 days. But more importantly, Patton's unit arrived prepared to fight immediately. Working to the American advantage is Adolf Hitler, who tells his officers that the operation is irrevocable. Through his absolute commitment to the plan, the Germans initially catch the Allies by surprise. For a brief moment, it gives them hope of a renewed victory. But in the end, the Battle of the Ardennes Forest becomes another in a long series of German defeats and the last offensive of World War II. Towards the end of World War II, American B-29 high-altitude bombers struck into the heart of Japan. But what followed brought the Japanese a nightmare unequaled in history, one of the most horrendous firestorms ever. Charles Phillips was a B-29 bomber pilot in the skies over Tokyo. This is where he witnessed the fires of hell on the battlefront. After 4 years of fighting the Japanese, Americans realized that the only way to get the enemy to submit would be by bombing their homeland. Since there is no base close enough to Japan, B-29 bombers, the latest in the arsenal of aerial weaponry, fly from Chengdu, China. It's a long and arduous flight. But the B-29 is the key to American air strategy. These revolutionary, heavily armed bombers, the largest produced in the war, are capable of flying at altitudes of 38,000 feet and are able to carry payloads up to 15,000 pounds. Finally, the Americans get a foothold in the Mariana Islands in 1944 and build air bases for long-range bombers. It's only 1,500 miles to Japan. It isn't a moment too soon for Charles Phillips, who pilots a B-29.
The Chinese operation was a nightmare of logistics. Everything that was used by the B-29 from those remote bases near Chengdu, China, had to be airlifted over the Himalaya mountains, the tallest mountains in the world. So as soon as an airfield could be prepared on the island of Tinian, General LeMay ordered them to relocate from where they were and come on over to Tinian.
On November 24th, the first wave of superfortresses takes off for Japan in a series of raids designed to bring the Japanese people to their knees. Meanwhile, back in the United States, more and more men are being rushed through training. Most of the men are impressed with the new bomber, but it's still highly classified, and they are restricted by tight security. For the pilots, though, the plane's enormous size presents its own problems.
The B-29 would weigh 70 tons, 140,000 pounds, and you always hoped that every one of the engines would perform well, because the takeoff was the most critical part of the entire mission.
Trainees are briefed in all aspects of flying the new B-29s, but until they're in battle, it's all theoretical. New planes are fitted and readied for flying to bases in Guam and the Marianas. Since the Japanese have lost so many planes in other battles, fighter pilots are reassigned to ground crews and anti-aircraft batteries.
Japanese air and naval forces were depleted, both through combat losses and training accidents. The Japanese, by this time, were trying to withhold some of their best pilots for forthcoming battles. So many of the pilots were young, new recruits. The problem that the Japanese had with air defense over the homeland is that they simply had no integrated system to defend the skies over Japan. As far as their Air Force, there were only 2 night fighter units, that is about 40 aircraft total, available for the defense of all of Tokyo.
As soon as B-29s are spotted, the gunners go into action, but the bombers are too high for their shells.
The early missions were made in formation. They were all made in daylight. They would have to form up in formation. They would have to climb to above 30,000 feet and then work their way into the target. There were these great high-altitude winds blowing. So the result was that they didn't hit a whole lot of targets real accurately.
The B-29 was a formidable weapon, certainly against the average Japanese plane. I mean, they would find themselves outgunned and dwarfed by this behemoth.
In daylight, it was a typical formation. Would be 9 aircraft with a leader and a deputy leader, and there were 3 groups of 3. The closer that they could fly together, the better they could defend themselves from fighter attacks. In the high-altitude attacks against Japan, the Japanese fighters had a terrible time because they couldn't keep up. They had to loiter out ahead of the formation and then make passes that would take them into the next formation and on and on. They could not make a tail chase and hope to catch up with us. B-29 was just too fast for them.
By the beginning of 1945, the B-29 raids are more accurate and are having a major effect on Japanese war production, adding to the threat of approaching American forces and the loss of important foreign bases. As the B-29 raids intensify, Japan's defense measures become desperate. Over 8 million children and non-essential urban dwellers are evacuated to the country. Those who remain are mobilized into civilian defense brigades. Slogans such as 100 million, one mind are commonplace. But the average Japanese, faced with destruction at home and defeat abroad, have begun to lose trust in the military leaders. Only for the emperor do they reserve their wholehearted respect and devotion. He embodies the Yamato spirit, for which the Japanese will make any sacrifice, including life itself.
The Japanese have an expression, shikata ga nai, which means it's inevitable. It cannot be helped. By early 1945, many of the Japanese probably did look on the war as something that was shikata ga nai. It was something that was happening to them and around them, but something that they were powerless to do anything about. The Japanese had seen the war take a steady toll on their quality of food, quality of clothing, and they had also seen their health care deteriorate. In other words, all of the things that people work for had steadily deteriorated throughout the course of the war.
In spite of inadequate planes and inferior guns, Japanese defenses are effective. After 22 raids, only 5% of damage is done to industrial targets. The headwinds over the mainland of Japan have made precision bombing difficult from high altitudes. And aside from the Japanese fighters, there are other risks for the bombers.